I stood silently in the entryway, holding a warm apple pie, when I heard my daughter-in-law whisper the 4 words that broke my heart. She said, "She is suffocating us." But the real sting came when my own son, the boy I raised alone, simply replied, "I know." I did not make a scene. I did not even drop the pie. Instead, I quietly walked back to my car, and the very next morning, I put my $650,000 family home on the market, without telling a soul. 6 weeks later, my son pulled into my driveway only to find a sold sign and a family of strangers moving in. I was already 40 miles away, sipping coffee on a balcony that finally felt like home, while he was left staring at a house that was no longer mine to give. Before I reveal how that one moment of silence changed everything, I want to ask you, have you ever felt like a stranger in your own family? Please let me know in the comments which state you are watching from today. Note: while this story is a dramatization created for reflection, the message about self-worth and setting boundaries is a very real lesson for us all. They did not hear me come in. I had used my key. It was the one my son, David, had pressed into my palm 6 years ago, at the closing of his house. I remember that day so clearly. He looked so much like his father when he said it. He had that same square jaw. He had that same easy smile that made you believe everything was going to be fine. He had looked at me with such warmth and said, "Mom, this is your home too. Any time." I remember thinking how proud James would have been. James was my husband. He was the kind of man who believed in family above everything else. The front door was unlocked anyway. It usually was on Sunday afternoons. I had driven 40 minutes from my side of Raleigh with an apple pie still warm in the passenger seat. It was wrapped in a dish towel that had belonged to my mother. The scent of cinnamon and brown sugar filled the car for the entire drive. It was a comforting smell. A smell that reminded me of better days. I had made that pie 100 times. Maybe more. My late husband used to joke that I could sell those pies and retire early. I would always laugh and tell him that I was already retired. He would just chuckle and shake his head. That was the kind of man he was. He found joy in the simple things. I stood in the entryway and heard their voices coming from the kitchen. I heard my son. I heard his wife, Emily. And then I heard a voice I did not recognize at first. It turned out to be a friend of Emily visiting from Charlotte. I was not eavesdropping. I want to be very clear about that. I was simply standing there, holding a pie, and waiting for the right moment to announce myself. That is what you do when a conversation is already going. You wait for a gap. You wait for a breath. I was 72 years old. I had been a nurse for 31 years. I had held the hands of people as they left this world. I knew how to be still. I knew how to wait. I had raised my son alone for 4 of those years when his father got sick the first time. I had worked double shifts at Wake Medical just so he could go to the college he wanted. I had driven to this house every Sunday for 3 years. I did it because I thought that was what mothers were supposed to do. Mothers show up. Mothers bring things. Mothers try to stay close to the lives they helped build. As I stood in the hallway, adjusting the weight of the warm pie in my hands, I felt a sense of peace. I looked at the photos on the wall. There was a picture of my granddaughter, Grace, on her first day of kindergarten. There was a photo of David and Emily at the beach. I felt like I was part of the foundation of this house. But then, I heard my name. It was not the way you hear your own name when someone is about to call you into the room. It was the other way. The way people speak when they think the person they are talking about is miles away. I stood very still. The warmth from the pie was seeping through the towel and into my skin. But suddenly, I felt very, very cold. I did not know it yet. But the life I thought I had was about to change forever. I was about to learn that sometimes, the people you would do anything for are the ones who find your presence to be a burden. I took a deep breath. I waited. And then, the words began to fall like stones. I stood there in the entryway of my son's home, a house I had helped him buy, holding a pie that was still warm enough to fog up my glasses. The hallway was quiet, filled only with the ticking of the grandfather clock that James and I had given them as a housewarming gift. But from the kitchen, the voices were clear. It is funny how sound travels in an open floor plan. It is designed for connection, yet that day it served only to deliver a blow I never saw coming. I heard Emily's voice first. Emily is my daughter-in-law. I have always tried to like her. Truly I have. She is organized. She is efficient. She keeps a spotless home. But her voice that afternoon had a sharp edge to it, like a knife scraping against a china plate. She was talking to a woman I did not recognize at first, a friend from Charlotte named Sarah. "Your mother-in-law came by twice last week," Emily said. Her voice was low, but in the stillness of the afternoon it carried perfectly. I could hear the exhaustion in her tone. I do not know how to say this without sounding awful, but it is starting to feel like a lot. It is starting to feel like she is suffocating us. The word suffocating hit me like a physical weight. I looked down at the apple pie in my hands. I had spent 3 hours peeling those apples. I had crimped the crust just the way David liked it when he was a little boy. I had driven 40 minutes across Raleigh because I thought they would be happy to see me. I thought I was bringing a piece of love into their home. But to Emily, I was just a source of pressure. I was someone who was taking up too much air in the room. There was a long pause. I waited for my son to speak. I waited for David to say, "Emily, she is just lonely," or "Mom means well," or even just, "She is my mother. Let us be patient." I had raised that boy. I had worked double shifts as a nurse at Wake Medical for 31 years to make sure he never wanted for anything. I had held him through fevers. I had cheered the loudest at his graduations. I thought I knew his heart. Then David spoke. He only said 2 words. "I know." That was it. Just "I know." Not a defense. Not a gentle correction. Just an agreement. It was the sound of a door slamming shut in my face. My own son, the man who had once been the little boy who cried when I left the room, was now agreeing that my presence was a burden. He agreed that I was suffocating them. Emily continued, her voice gaining a bit more confidence now that she knew David was on her side. "It is not that I do not love her, Sarah. It is just that we have our own lives here. We have our own routines. We have our own way of doing things. I feel like she does not fully see that. She just shows up. She acts like she still lives here." "I will talk to her," David said. His voice sounded tired. He sounded like he was dealing with a chore, like a leaky faucet or a lawn that needed mowing. "You keep saying that," Emily replied. "But she just does not seem to understand that she is not really. I mean, our priority right now has to be us. Our family. Our daughter. You know what I mean." I stood there, frozen. I felt like a ghost haunting my own family. I looked at the photos on the wall again. There was a photo of the 3 of them at a pumpkin patch. I was not in that photo. I realized then that I was not in many of their photos lately. I was the person behind the camera, or the person they visited out of obligation on holidays. I was not part of the us Emily was talking about. I felt a sudden, sharp memory of James. My husband had been gone for 2 years. If he were here, he would have been standing right beside me. He would have taken that pie from my hands and led me out the door. He would have told me that I deserved better than to stand in a hallway and be picked apart like a piece of old furniture. But James was not there. I was 72 years old, and I was standing in a house where I was no longer wanted. I looked at the key in my pocket, the key David had given me. The ket was supposed to represent a permanent invitation. I realized that the key was just a piece of metal now. It did not open the door to his heart anymore. The friend from Charlotte said something about how hard it is with parents as they get older. She spoke about them as if they were a problem to be solved, a decline to be managed. They talked about boundaries and space. They used all those modern words that sound polite but feel like ice. I realized that every time I had called, every time I had stopped by with a treat or an offer to babysit, I was not being helpful. I was being an intrusion. I was the suffocating mother-in-law. I had spent 3 years since James died, trying to stay close to the only family I had left. I had convinced myself that they needed me. But the truth was, they only tolerated me. My hands began to shake. The warmth of the pie was starting to fade. I realized I could not stay another second. If I walked into that kitchen now, I would have to pretend I had not heard. I would have to smile and listen to their polite lies. I would have to watch David look at his watch and wait for me to leave. I could not do it. I could not shrink myself down any smaller. I had spent my whole life being a nurse, a wife, and a mother. I had spent my life caring for others, putting their needs first, and making sure everyone else was comfortable. And here I was, at the end of it all, being told that I was taking up too much space. I turned around. I did not make a sound. I had spent decades walking softly on hospital floors. I knew how to move without being heard. I walked out the front door, the same door that David had told me would always be open. I closed it behind me, making sure the latch clicked softly. I was not angry yet. I was just hollow. I was a woman who had just discovered that the foundation she had built her life on was made of sand. I walked down the driveway, past David's shiny SUV and Emily's neat little garden. I got into my car and sat there. I looked at the house in the rearview mirror. It was a beautiful house. It was a house filled with light and expensive furniture and the sounds of a young family. But as I looked at it, I realized it was not my home. It never had been. It was their fortress. And I was just a visitor who had stayed too long. I put the car in reverse and backed out. I did not look back again. I had heard enough. I had heard the truth. And the truth was a cold, hard thing that no amount of apple pie could ever sweeten. I drove away from David's house with the apple pie still sitting on the passenger seat. The towel is browning from the heat of the crust. I drove slowly, watching the familiar trees of the neighborhood pass by. It is a beautiful part of Raleigh. The oaks are tall, and the lawns are perfectly manicured. It is the kind of place people move to when they want to show the world they have made it. I drove for 10 minutes before I realized I did not want to go home. My home was a quiet house in a different suburb, a house that felt too big since James passed away. If I went there now, I would just sit in the silence and hear Emily's voice over and over again, suffocating. A lot. Not our priority. I pulled into the parking lot of a small park near the Beltline. It was a place where James and I used to walk when we were younger. I turned off the engine. The silence that rushed in was heavy. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I sat there for a long time, just looking at the pie. The steam had stopped rising. The scent of cinnamon was still there, but it felt mocking now. I thought about the math of loneliness. That is what I call it. It is a strange calculation. You think that if you give 100% of your love, you will get at least 50% back. You think that if you show up, you are valued. But the math does not always work out that way. Sometimes the more you give, the less you are worth in the eyes of the people receiving it. I thought about my life as a nurse. I had spent 31 years at Wake Medical. I had seen the best and worst of humanity. I had seen families huddled together in waiting rooms, praying for one more day with a loved one. I had seen children weep at the bedside of their parents. I had always believed that family was the ultimate safety net. I believed that if you poured your life into your children, they would be there to catch you when you got old. I was wrong. Or maybe I had just misunderstood what being there meant. David was there, technically. He answered my texts. He lets me come over on Sundays. But his heart was not there. He was just performing a duty. He was waiting for his turn to live his life without me in the way. Our priority has to be us, Emily had said. I whispered those words out loud in the cold car. Our priority has to be us. I realized that in her mind, and apparently in David's mind, I was no longer part of the us. I was an outlier. I was an accessory. I was something to be managed, like a retirement account or a health insurance policy. I was not a person with feelings and a history and a heart that was still very much alive. I felt a surge of something hot in my chest. It was not anger yet. It was a profound sense of injustice. I had worked double shifts so David could go to camp. I had skipped vacations so he could have the best soccer cleats. I had sat in the front row of every play and every game. I had been his rock when James died. And now, at 72, I was being told that I was a lot. I thought about all the women I knew, women like Betty and Ruth. We all did the same thing. We all spent our lives being the glue that held everything together. And then, one day, the glue is no longer needed, and everyone wonders why you are still sticking around. I looked at my hands. They were the hands of a nurse. They were wrinkled now, with spots of age. But they were strong. They had delivered babies. They had cleaned wounds. They had comforted the dying. These were not the hands of a woman who should be begging for a place at her son's table. I realized that I had been shrinking myself. For 3 years, I had been making myself smaller and smaller. I waited for them to call. I waited for them to invite me. I didn't want to intrude. So I checked my phone every 10 minutes, hoping for a sign that I was wanted. I had turned my entire life into a waiting room. I was waiting for permission to be a part of my own family. It was a pathetic way to live. I looked at the apple pie. Suddenly, I was furious at that pie. It represented all my wasted efforts. It represented the 3 years I had spent trying to buy their love with baked goods and forced smiles. I opened the car door and walked to a nearby trash can. I threw the pie away. The whole thing. Plate, towel, and all. I watched it hit the bottom with a thud. It felt like a declaration of war. Or maybe a declaration of independence. I got back in the car and started the engine. I didn't feel hollow anymore. I felt cold. A very specific kind of cold that comes when you finally stop trying to warm yourself by a fire that has gone out. I thought about my house. It was a 4-bedroom colonial. It was worth a lot of money in this market. I had paid it off years ago. James and I had worked hard for that equity. I had a pension. I had social security. I had a healthy 401k. I was not a woman who needed to be anyone's burden. If I were suffocating them, fine. I would give them all the air in the world. I would give them so much space they wouldn't know what to do with it. I drove home, but I didn't go to the kitchen. I went to my office. I sat down at the mahogany desk that James had bought me for our 25th anniversary. I pulled out a yellow legal pad. I began to make a list. First, I wrote down the name of my realtor, Linda. She had been a friend for 20 years. She knew the value of my home. Second, I wrote down the name of my lawyer. Third, I wrote down Carrie. I had always liked the town of Carrie. It was close enough to Raleigh to be familiar, but far enough away to be a new start. There were lovely communities there for people my age. Not nursing homes, not places where you go to fade away, but places where you go to live. I felt a strange sense of excitement. It was the first time I had felt excited about anything since James died. For 2 years, I had been trying to recreate the past. I had been trying to keep the family unit together, even though the unit had moved on. I had been living for David. But David had his own priority. He had Emily. He had Grace. He had his life. It was time I had mine. I realized that the most dangerous thing I had done was organize my life around people who were not organizing their lives around me. It was a mistake many women of my generation made. We were taught that our value was in our service to others. We were taught that a good mother is one who is always available, always giving, always waiting. Well, I was done waiting. I sat in my quiet house that night. But for the first time, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt like an empty canvas. I looked at the photos of David on the mantel. I still loved him. That would never change. But I didn't have to be a martyr for him. I didn't have to stay in Raleigh and wait for a Sunday invitation that was given out of pity. I thought about what David would say when he found out. He would be shocked. He would be hurt, perhaps. He would ask why I didn't talk to him. But I had tried to talk to him. I had tried at the BBQ restaurant on Glenwood. I had tried with my presence every Sunday. He hadn't listened because it was easier not to. It was easier to let Emily complain and then agree with her than it was to actually deal with his mother's loneliness. I wouldn't give him the chance to talk me out of it. I wouldn't give him the chance to make more empty promises. I was going to move in silence. I was going to sell this house, take my money, and find a place where I was the priority. I went to bed that night and slept better than I had in years. I didn't dream of James. I didn't dream of the kitchen in the other house. I dreamed of a balcony. I dreamed of a small garden of herbs. I dreamed of a life that was genuinely, finally, my own. The math was simple now. 1 minus 3 equals 1. I was the one. And for the first time in 72 years, that was enough. I sat in my darkened living room that evening, the yellow legal pad resting on my lap. I did not turn on the lamps. I found that I preferred the shadows. They felt more honest. In the dimness, I could see the outlines of my life. The heavy oak bookshelves, the recliner where James used to sit, the small porcelain birds my mother had collected. To understand why I did what I did, you have to understand the life I led before that Sunday afternoon. You have to understand the math that governed my world for 72 years. I was a nurse at Wake Medical for 31 years. That is a long time to spend walking the halls of a hospital. If you have ever been a nurse, you know that the job changes you. You see things that stay with you. You see the fragility of the human body. But more importantly, you see the fragility of human connections. I had spent 3 decades holding the hands of people as they prepared to leave this world. I had seen families at their absolute worst and their absolute best. I knew how to read people. I knew the difference between a family that was united by love and a family that was united by obligation. I had seen children who looked at their dying parents with genuine grief. And I had seen children who looked at their watches, wondering how much longer the process would take. I never thought I would be one of the parents who was being timed. I raised David mostly on my own for 4 of the most critical years of his life. That was when James got sick the first time. We caught it early, or so we thought. But the treatment was brutal. James was a shadow of himself. He was the man I loved, but he was also a full-time patient. During those years, I worked double shifts. I worked the graveyard shift because it paid more. I remember the smell of industrial floor cleaner at 3 in the morning. I remember the squeak of my white nursing shoes on the linoleum. I was exhausted, bone-deep exhausted. But I didn't mind. I did it because I had a goal. I wanted David to have the life we had promised him. I wanted him to go to the university he dreamed of. I wanted him to never feel the weight of our struggle. I made sure he had hot meals. I made sure his laundry was clean. I made sure he felt like the center of the universe. Even while his father was fighting for his life and his mother was running on 4 hours of sleep. That was the math I lived by back then. I believed that if I poured everything I had into him, the vessel of our family would always be full. I believed that love was a cumulative thing, that the sacrifices I made when I was 40 would be remembered when I was 70. But I was learning that loneliness has its own kind of math. When you get to be my age, your world starts to shrink. It happens slowly at first. You retire, and the colleagues you saw every day become people you exchange Christmas cards with once a year. Your friends move away to be closer to their own children. Some of them pass away. The busy, noisy world you used to navigate so easily starts to feel a bit more distant. You find yourself holding on tighter to the things that remain. And for most of us, that thing is our children. I want to explain why I showed up at David's house every Sunday. From the outside, it might have looked needy. Emily certainly thought it was suffocating. But from the inside, it felt like survival. When you live alone, silence can become very loud. You start to do things just to feel like you are still a part of the stream of life. You bake a pie because you want a reason to see a familiar face. You drive 40 minutes because you want to hear the sound of your granddaughter's laughter. You offer to help with the laundry or the dishes because you want to feel useful. Being useful is the greatest drug for a person who is aging. We spend our lives being needed. We are needed by our bosses, our husbands, our children. And then, suddenly, we are not. The world tells us it is time to relax. It tells us we have earned our rest. But for many of us, rest feels a lot like being discarded. So we show up. We bring things. We try to stay close. We try to prove that we still have something of value to offer. I see now that this was my mistake. I was trying to force a connection that was no longer natural. I was looking for a return on an investment I had made decades ago. But children are not bank accounts. You do not get to withdraw love just because you deposited it years before. I sat there in the dark and thought about the word David had used. I know. He knew I was suffocating them. He knew I was lonely. And he had decided that his comfort was more important than my presence. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent worrying about him. I thought about the nights I had stayed up waiting for him to come home when he was a teenager. I thought about the way I had carefully managed the family finances after James died to make sure David's inheritance was protected. The math did not add up. I had given everything, and in return, I was an intrusion. I was a problem to be talked about in hushed tones in a kitchen I had helped pay for. It is a hard thing to realize that you are the secondary character in your own life. We all think we are the leads. We think our story is the one everyone is following. But that night I realized I had become a background actor in David's story. I was the aging mother, the one who brings the pie, the one who is a lot. I realized that if I stayed in this house, if I kept making those Sunday drives, I would just be waiting for the day I was moved to an even smaller role. Maybe a phone call once a month. Maybe a visit on Christmas morning for an hour before they went to Emily's parents. I was 72. I probably had 10 or 15 good years left. Maybe more. I was healthy. My mind was sharp. I could still drive. I could still cook. I could still think. Did I want to spend those years as a beggar? Did I want to spend my remaining time on this earth waiting for the crumbs of attention my son was willing to drop from his table? The answer was a resounding no. I picked up the pen. I looked at the yellow paper. I thought about all the patients I had cared for who had no one. I thought about the ones who died alone because they had no family. I used to feel so sorry for them. But that night, I realized that at least they knew where they stood. They weren't fooling themselves. I was done fooling myself. I was going to stop being a burden by simply removing the weight. If I was suffocating them, I would go somewhere where I could breathe on my own. I would take my history, my memories, and my $650,000 of equity, and I would build a world where I was the priority. I realized that the math of loneliness only works if you are alone. But I wasn't going to be alone. I was going to be with myself. And for the first time, I was going to make sure that was enough. The following morning, I did not call David. I did not text him to thank him for the visit I never actually had. Instead, I made a pot of coffee and sat on my back porch. It was a beautiful morning in North Carolina. The air was soft, and the birds were busy in the trees. I felt a strange sense of clarity. It was like the fog had lifted. I knew what I had to do, but I needed to hear a voice that wasn't my own. I needed to talk to someone who had known me before I was just David's mother. I called Betty. Betty and I have been friends for 26 years. We met when we were both working the floor at the hospital. We had been through everything together. Divorces, deaths, the transition into retirement. Betty is the kind of woman who does not sugarcoat things. She is a straight shooter from South Carolina. And she has a way of seeing through the nonsense. She answered on the second ring. "Martha, is everything okay?" she asked. She knew my routine. She knew I was usually at the grocery store or at my walking group on Monday mornings. "I heard them, Betty," I said. My voice was steady. I was surprised by how steady it was. "Heard who? What happened?" I told her. I told her about the Sunday drive. I told her about the apple pie. I told her about standing in the hallway and hearing Emily say I was suffocating them. And I told her about David's response. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Betty breathing. I could hear the faint sound of her television in the background. Finally, she spoke. "Oh, Martha, I am so sorry, but I am not surprised." That was the second blow of the week. "What do you mean you are not surprised?" I asked. "Honey," Betty said gently, I have watched you for the last 2 years. You have been running yourself ragged, trying to be a part of a life they are clearly moving away from. Every time we have lunch, all you talk about is David and Emily and Grace. You tell me about the things you did for them, and then you tell me how they didn't really have time to talk. You tell me about the holidays you spent waiting for them to call. I felt a flush of embarrassment. Had I been that transparent? Had I been the woman who complains about her children while still obsessing over them? I thought I was just being a mother, I whispered. You were, Betty said. But Martha, you have been ignoring the signs. Remember last Thanksgiving? You told me you were going to Emily's parents' house because that is where they wanted to be. You said you didn't mind. But I saw your face. You minded. And remember when Grace had her birthday party? And they told you it was just for school friends. But then you saw photos on Facebook with Emily's whole family there. I closed my eyes. I had forgotten that. Or rather, I had chosen to forget it. I had pushed it down into a dark corner of my mind because it was too painful to look at. I had made excuses for them. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding. I told myself they were just busy. There is a way of being unkind that doesn't look like unkindness, Betty continued. It looks like being busy. It looks like being overwhelmed. It looks like forgetting to call back, but it is still unkindness. It is a way of making someone feel small without ever having to say a mean word to their face. She was right. I had been receiving those small unkindnesses for a long time. I thought about the texts David sent. Once a week, maybe. Usually a picture of Grace doing something cute. No question about how I was. No. I love you, Mom. Just a broadcast of their life, as if I were a fan on social media rather than a mother. I thought about the way Emily would look at her phone when I was talking. The way she would start cleaning the kitchen while I was still eating. A silent signal that my time was up. I am selling the house, Betty, I said. I heard a gasp. Martha? Are you serious? You love that house. James is in that house. James isn't in the floorboards, Betty. He is in here, I said, touching my chest. And that house is too big for a ghost. I am selling it, and I am moving to Carrie. I am going to find a place where I am not an intrusion. I am going to find a place where I can breathe. Betty started to cry. I am so proud of you. I've wanted to tell you to do this for a year, but I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want to be the one to tell you that your son was being a jerk. He isn't a jerk, I said, still feeling the need to defend him. He is just living the life I prepared him for. I taught him to be independent. I taught him to build his own world. I just didn't realize that in his world, there wasn't a room for me. Then you build your own world, Betty said, and you make sure it is a beautiful one. We talked for an hour. We talked about realtors and moving companies. We talked about the communities in Kerry. For the first time in years, we didn't talk about David. We talked about me. After I hung up, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was the weight of pretense. I didn't have to pretend everything was fine anymore. I didn't have to pretend that my Sunday visits were successful. I didn't have to pretend that I wasn't lonely. I looked at the framed photo of the three of us on the side table. David's college graduation. We were all so happy. James was still healthy. We felt like a unit, an unbreakable unit. I realized then that life is lived in seasons. That season was beautiful and it was over. You cannot keep living in the summer when the leaves have already started to fall. You have to prepare for the winter, or you will freeze. I walked into the kitchen and looked at the empty space on the counter where the pie had been. I felt a sense of peace. I was not going to be the suffocating mother-in-law anymore. I was going to be Martha, just Martha. I went to my desk and picked up the phone. It was time to call Linda, the realtor. It was time to put the sign in the yard. I thought about the silence in the house. For the first time, it didn't feel like a void. It felt like a deep breath. I was 72 years old, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't doing something for David. I wasn't doing something for James. I was doing something for myself. And as the sun began to set over the trees in my backyard, casting long golden shadows across the grass, I knew I was doing the right thing. I was taking my life back, one piece of paper at a time. I spent many hours in the days following my discovery, just sitting and thinking. I thought about how I had gotten to this point. I realized that the Sunday afternoon in the hallway was not the beginning, it was the end. It was the final period at the end of a very long and painful sentence. I found myself thinking back to about 8 months before that day. I remember it because it was October. The leaves were just starting to turn gold and crimson in Raleigh. It was a beautiful time of year. I had reached a point where I felt like I was screaming underwater. I could feel the distance between David and me growing every day. It was not a sudden break. It was a slow drift, like a boat untied from a dock, slowly floating out into the mist. I decided I had to do something. I believed that if I could just get him alone, away from the distractions of his busy life and Emily's tight schedules, we could find each other again. I called him and asked if he would have lunch with me. Just the two of us. I told him I missed him. He sounded hesitant on the phone. He checked his calendar. He sighed. But eventually, he agreed. We met on a Tuesday at that old barbecue place on Glenwood Avenue. It is a Raleigh landmark. The kind of place with red checkered tablecloths and the smell of hickory smoke that clings to your clothes for hours. David had loved that place since he was 19 years old. James and I used to take him there after his college football games. I arrived early. I sat in a booth in the back, watching the door. When he walked in, my heart skipped a beat. He looked so much like his father in the midday light. He was wearing his work clothes, a crisp button-down shirt, a fancy watch. He looked successful. He looked important. But he also looked like he was in a hurry. He checked his phone before he even sat down. We ordered the usual. Pulled pork, collard greens, hush puppies. The food was as good as it always was, but the conversation felt like a struggle. We talked about his job. We talked about Grace's soccer practice. We talked about the weather. We talked about everything except the one thing that mattered. I waited until we were halfway through our meal. I put my fork down. I took a deep breath. I looked him right in the eye. I said, as gently as I could, "David, I feel like something has shifted between us. I miss you. I feel like I am losing my son." I will never forget the look on his face. It was not sadness. It was not regret. It was discomfort. It was the look of a man who had been caught doing something wrong and was trying to figure out how to get away. He picked up his fork and pushed a piece of pork around his plate. He would not look back at me. "Mom, everything is fine," he said. His voice was dismissive. "We have just been really, really busy. You know how it is. Work is crazy. Emily is overwhelmed with the house. We are just trying to keep our heads above water." "I know you are busy," I replied. "I am not asking for much. I am not asking for every day. I just want to feel like I am still a part of your life. I want to feel like I matter to you." He finally looked at me, but his eyes were cold. "You do matter, Mom. But you have to understand. We have our own life now. We have a lot on our plates. I will have Emily. Check the calendar. We will find a Sunday soon where we can all get together. We will find a Sunday." He didn't say, "I am sorry, Mom." He didn't say, "I miss you too." He just promised a date in the future that he knew would never come. And I knew it too. As I sat there in that loud, smoky restaurant, I realized that I was begging. I was a 72-year-old woman begging her son for a few hours of his time. It felt shameful. It felt wrong. We finished the meal in near silence. He paid the bill. He gave me a quick, one-armed hug in the parking lot. He told me he would call me later that week. He didn't call. He didn't call that week. He didn't call the next month. That was when I started the Sunday drives. I thought that if I just showed up, he wouldn't be able to ignore me. I thought I could force the connection back into existence. I see now that was my greatest mistake. You cannot make someone value you by explaining to them that they should. It does not work that way. Value is not something you negotiate. It is something someone gives you because they want to, because they see you. Because they love you. I sat in my living room and thought about that lunch on Glenwood. I realized that David had given me the answer 8 months ago. I just hadn't wanted to hear it. I had been so desperate to keep my family together that I had ignored the truth. He had already moved on. He had already decided that his priority was the family he had built with Emily. And in his mind, there was no room for a mother who remembered him when he was small. It was a bitter pill to swallow. I felt a deep, aching sadness for that little boy who used to hold my hand. But that boy was gone. In his place was a man who saw me as an obligation, a man who agreed that I was suffocating his life. I stood up and walked to the window. The sun was setting over the Raleigh skyline. I thought about the thousands of meals I had cooked for him, the thousands of miles I had driven for him, the way I had sacrificed my own needs for his. I didn't regret those things. I did them out of love. But I realized that love is not a debt that can be collected. I had been trying to live in a house that had been torn down years ago. I was trying to sleep in a bed that wasn't there. I was trying to eat at a table that had been moved. It was time to stop. It was time to accept that the son I raised was now a stranger who happened to have my eyes. I felt a strange sense of relief as I accepted this. The burden of trying to fix it was gone. I couldn't fix it. I couldn't make him love me the way I wanted him to. I could only control what I did next. I could only decide how I was going to spend the rest of my days. I wasn't going to be a beggar anymore. I wasn't going to spend another minute waiting for a Sunday that would never come. I was done with Glenwood Avenue. I was done with the red checkered tablecloths and the empty promises. I was going to build a new table, a table where I was the guest of honor. My mother was a woman of iron and lace. She had lived to be 89 years old, and she had seen the world change in ways that are hard to imagine. She had been a nurse during the Second World War. She had raised 3 children during the Depression. She was the kind of woman who never complained. But she never let anyone walk over her either. As I sat at my mahogany desk with my yellow legal pad, I could almost hear her voice in my ear. She used to have a saying that I didn't truly understand until I was in my 70s. She would sit in her rocking chair, sipping her tea, and she would say, "Martha, the most dangerous thing a woman can do is organize her whole life around people who are not organizing their lives around her." She was right. She was always right about people. She understood that if you make yourself a doormat, people will not thank you for it. They will simply wipe their feet on you and move on to the next room. I had spent the last 3 years being a doormat. I had been waiting for David to tell me I was important. I had been waiting for Emily to tell me I was welcome. I had been a satellite orbiting a planet that didn't even know I was there. I picked up my pen. It was a heavy silver pen that James had given me for our 30th anniversary. It felt solid in my hand. I wrote at the top of the page in my best nursing script, "The plan of independence." I started with the numbers. I have always been good with numbers. You have to be when you are a nurse managing medications and heart rates. I wrote down the value of my house, $650,000. It was a conservative estimate. The market in Raleigh was booming. People were moving here from all over the country. I knew I could sell it in a week. Next, I wrote down my savings. My pension from 31 years at Wake Medical. My social security. My retirement accounts. I realized, with a start, that I was a wealthy woman. I didn't need David's help. I didn't need to live in a small apartment or worry about my bills. I had worked hard. James and I had lived a careful, disciplined life. We had saved for a rainy day. Well, the rain was here, and I had a very sturdy umbrella. I felt a surge of power. For 3 years, I had felt weak. I had felt needy. I had felt like a burden. But the numbers told a different story. I was an independent woman with the resources to go anywhere and do anything. I wrote down the word Cary. Cary was a beautiful town just a few miles away. It was known for its greenways and its quiet neighborhoods. It had some of the best communities for people my age in the entire state. I didn't want a nursing home. I wasn't sick. I wanted a place with a balcony and a view. I wanted a place where the grass was mowed by someone else, and the maintenance was taken care of. I wanted a place where I could be Martha, not the grandmother from Raleigh. I thought about the house I was currently sitting in. I had lived here for 20 years. Every corner of it was filled with memories of James. His rose bushes in the backyard, the spot on the carpet where David had spilled grape juice when he was 10, the height marks on the pantry door. I felt a twinge of sadness, but it was followed by a realization. Memories are not in the walls. They are in the heart. If I stayed here, I would be a prisoner of the past. I would be a ghost, haunting a museum of a life that no longer existed. I would be sitting by the phone, waiting for it to ring, surrounded by things that reminded me of a family that had moved on without me. I wasn't going to do it. I wrote down the name Linda. Linda was a realtor I had known for 20 years. She was sharp. She was honest. She would get the job done without any drama. I decided I would call her on Monday morning. I felt a strange sense of excitement. It was a feeling I hadn't felt in a long time. It was the feeling of a new beginning. I was 72 years old, and I was going to run away from home. I wasn't leaving out of anger. I wasn't leaving to punish David. I was leaving because I deserved a life that wasn't lived in the shadows of someone else's happiness. I thought about the Sunday drives. I thought about the apple pies. I realized that those things were my way of trying to buy my way into David's life. I was using food and presents to try and force him to love me the way he used to. It was a form of manipulation, really. A gentle, loving manipulation, but manipulation nonetheless. I was done with that. I wrote down one final sentence at the bottom of the page. It was a sentence that would guide me through the next few months. I am not invisible. I am just standing in the wrong room. I sat back and looked at the yellow paper. It was a map to my new life. It was a document of my own worth. I felt a deep sense of peace. For the first time since James died, I knew exactly what I was doing. I wasn't drifting anymore. I was steering the boat. I thought about what my mother would say if she could see me now. I could imagine her nodding her head, a small smile on her face. "About time, Martha," she would say. About time. I folded the legal pad and put it in the top drawer of my desk. I turned off the light and walked up the stairs to my bedroom. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt like a chrysalis. Something was changing inside of it. Something was being born. I went to bed and slept for 8 hours without waking once. I didn't dream of the kitchen on Glenwood Avenue. I didn't dream of David's cold eyes. I dreamed of a garden, a small garden of herbs on a sunny balcony. I dreamed of the smell of rosemary and lavender. I dreamed of the sound of the wind in the trees. When I woke up on Monday morning, I didn't check my phone for messages from David. I didn't wait for a text. I picked up the phone and dialed Linda's number. "Linda," I said when she answered. "It is Martha. I am ready to sell the house." The journey had begun. I was no longer a mother waiting for her son. I was a woman taking her first step toward freedom. And as I looked at the morning sun hitting the mahogany desk, I knew I was never going back. It took me exactly 3 weeks to make the first call. I did not want to act out of anger. Anger is a hot flame that burns out quickly, leaving nothing but ash. I wanted my decision to come from a place of cold, hard clarity. I wanted to be sure that I was moving towards something, not just running away. I sat at my mahogany desk on a Monday morning. The sun was streaming through the windows of the kitchen, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. I looked at the garden outside. James's rose bushes were in full bloom. Red, pink, white. I had spent so many hours pruning them, talking to them, keeping them alive because they were a piece of him. But as I sat there, I realized that I was tired of tending to things that could not love me back. I picked up the phone and dialed Linda. Linda had been our realtor for over 20 years. She was the one who had helped James and me find this house when we were looking for a place to grow old together. She was a sharp woman, always dressed in professional blazers, with a voice that sounded like smooth honey and grit. "Linda," I said when she picked up. "It is Martha. I am ready to list the house." There was a pause on the other end. Linda was not just a realtor. She was a woman who knew my history. She knew about James. She knew how much this house meant to me. "Martha," she said softly. Are you sure? This is a significant decision. You have been there for 2 decades. I have never been more sure of anything in my life, I replied. I know every creak in these floorboards. I know where the light hits the walls at 4 in the afternoon. And I know that it is time for someone else to make memories here. I am done. She came over that afternoon. She sat at my kitchen table, the same place where David used to do his homework, and where Emily and I had sat through so many awkward holiday coffees. Linda looked around the room with a practiced eye. The market in Raleigh is incredible right now, she said, pulling out some papers from her leather briefcase. Inventory is low, and people are desperate for well-maintained homes in this zip code. Based on the recent sales in the neighborhood, I think we should list it at $650,000. $650,000. I sat back in my chair. James and I had bought this house for a fraction of that amount. We had worked hard to pay off the mortgage early. We had lived simply, so we could own our piece of the world. Now, that piece of the world was worth a small fortune. That is a lot of money, Martha, Linda said, watching my face. That money will give you a lot of options. You could travel. You could buy a luxury condo. You could do whatever you want. I want peace, Linda, I said. That is the only luxury I am looking for. Then came the question I knew was coming. What does David think? Linda asked. She leaned forward, her expression concerned. Does he know you are selling? I took a sip of my tea. It was cold. No, I said. And I do not plan on telling him until the papers are signed. Linda blinked. Martha, are you sure that is wise? He is your only son. This is his childhood home. He might want a say in this. I looked out at the rose bushes. I have spent 72 years giving people a say in my life, I said firmly. I have spent 31 years as a nurse taking orders from doctors. I spent years as a wife making sure James was happy. And I have spent 3 years as a mother trying to be whatever David needed me to be. I am done asking for permission. I explained to her what I had learned. You cannot make someone value you by explaining to them that they should. If I told David I was selling, he would do one of 2 things. He would either ignore me because he was too busy, or he would try to talk me out of it because it was inconvenient for him. He would smile that easy smile and tell me everything was fine. And I would fall back into the same old trap. I am moving in silence, I told her. I want this handled quickly and quietly. I do not want a sign in the yard. I want an off-market pocket listing. You know enough people, Linda. Find me a buyer who will love this house and do it fast. Linda nodded slowly. She recognized a closed door when she saw one. I understand, Martha. I will get to work. We can probably have this under contract within a week. After she left, I walked through the house. I touched the door frame where we had marked David's height. 5 feet. 5 feet, 6 inches. 6 feet. I felt a twinge of sadness, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of liberation. I was no longer a keeper of a museum. I was a woman with $650,000 of equity and a future that belonged only to me. I realized that the most important thing I had learned in 72 years was that my value was not tied to this house. It was not tied to being a mother or a widow or a nurse. My value was inherent, and if the people in my life could not see that, then I would take my value somewhere else. I sat down in James's old chair. I didn't feel like I was betraying him. I felt like I was finally doing what he would have wanted me to do. He would have hated seeing me beg for scraps of attention. He would have wanted me to stand tall. I closed my eyes and listened to the silence. For the first time, the silence did not feel like loneliness. It felt like an investment in my own soul. The house went under contract 11 days later. A young couple from out of state. They had a small daughter. They loved the garden. They loved the light. They were willing to pay the full $650,000 in cash. I signed the initial paperwork on a Tuesday morning. As I put the pen down, I felt a click in my heart. The emotional cord had been cut. I was no longer waiting for David to call first. I was no longer waiting for a Sunday invitation. I was Martha. I was 72. I was wealthy. And I was finally free. Even with the house under contract, I knew I had work to do on my own mind. You cannot change 72 years of habits overnight. I had spent my whole life being available. I was the person people called when they were sick. I was the person people called when they needed a babysitter. I was the person who always said yes. Ruth, my friend from the walking group, had suggested I talk to a therapist. At first, I resisted. In my generation, you did not talk to strangers about your problems. You just put your head down and kept moving. But Ruth was persistent. She told me it wasn't about being weak. It was about being smart. So, I found myself sitting in the office of a woman named Dr. Patel. The office was small and quiet. There was a faint scent of lemon and old books. On the windowsill, there was a small purple plant in a clay pot. "That is a beautiful lavender plant," I said as I sat down. Dr. Patel smiled. She was a calm woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see right through you. "Thank you, Martha. Lavender is a hardy plant, but it needs very specific conditions to thrive. It needs a lot of light, and it needs to be left alone. If you water it too much, the roots will rot. It needs its own space." We talked for a long time about my life. I told her about James. I told her about the hospital. And finally, I told her about David and Emily. I told her about the Sunday drives and the apple pies and the words I had heard in the hallway. "What are you afraid will happen, Martha?" she asked me. "If you stop being so available to them? If you stop showing up with the pies?" I thought about it for a long time. I looked at the lavender plant. "I am afraid he will drift away completely," I finally said. My voice was small, like a child's. "I am afraid that if I am not useful, I will be forgotten. I am afraid that if I do not hold on to him with both hands, he will simply vanish from my life." Dr. Patel nodded slowly. "And if he did? If he drifted away because you stopped being his servant, would it be because you changed? Or would it be because the relationship was already empty?" The question felt like a cold splash of water. "Relationships are like plants," she continued, gesturing to the lavender. "You have been overwatering this relationship, Martha. You have been trying so hard to keep it alive that you have been drowning it, and in the process, you have been drowning yourself. You have been trying to prove your worth through your availability. But availability is not the same thing as love." I realized then that she was right. I had been using my presence as a way to force David to remember me. I was terrified of being invisible, so I made myself impossible to ignore. But being impossible to ignore is not the same as being wanted. In fact, it is the opposite. It creates resentment. "You are worried about him drifting away," Dr. Patel said. "But Martha, he has already drifted. You are standing on the shore, screaming at a boat that is already miles out at sea. Selling the house and moving to Carrie is not you leaving him. It is you finally turning around and looking at the beautiful land behind you." I thought about the word boundaries. It is a word you hear a lot these days. I used to think boundaries were like walls. I thought they were meant to keep people out. But Dr. Patel explained that boundaries are actually like fences with gates. They define where you end and someone else begins. "You have no fence, Martha," she told me. "You have let David and Emily walk all over your garden, and then you wondered why your flowers were dying." Setting a boundary is not an act of anger. It is an act of self-respect. It is saying, "I matter too much to be treated as an afterthought." I went home and looked at my reflection in the mirror. I looked at the wrinkles around my eyes and the grey in my hair. I had been a nurse for 31 years. I had saved lives. I had raised a man. I had survived the death of my soulmate. Why was I so afraid of a 38-year-old man's silence? I decided to perform an experiment. I decided I would stop being the one to initiate contact. I would stop texting him pictures of things I thought he would like. I would stop calling to check in. I would stop being the one who did all the emotional labor. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. The first week was agonizing. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaped, hoping it was him. It wasn't. It was usually a news alert or a message from Betty. I felt a deep sense of panic. He is forgetting me, I thought. I am disappearing. But then, The second week came. The panic started to fade, and something else took its place. Peace. I realized that I had so much more time when I wasn't obsessing over David's life. I started reading books again. I started taking long walks in the park, without checking my watch. I started cooking meals that I liked, rather than things I thought someone else would enjoy. I was like that lavender plant. I was finally getting enough light because I wasn't being smothered by my own expectations. I went back to see Dr. Patel a month later. "How are you feeling, Martha?" she asked. "I am feeling visible," I said. Not to him, but to myself. I realized that the reason I was so afraid of him drifting away was because I didn't think I was enough on my own. I thought I needed his validation to be a real person. And now? "And Joe," I said, catching myself using a word from my childhood. "And now, I know that I am the only person who can truly see me. I am the only one who knows the weight of my history. I am the only one who knows the strength it took to get here." I looked at the lavender plant. It looked healthier than the last time I had seen it. Its purple flowers were reaching for the sun. "I am moving to Kerry next month," I told her. "I found an apartment. It has a balcony. I am going to buy my own lavender plants. And I am going to make sure I give them plenty of space to grow." Dr. Patel smiled. "I think you are going to do just fine, Martha." I walked out of her office and felt the warm North Carolina air on my face. I wasn't a mother waiting for a call anymore. I was a woman with a plan. I was a woman who was learning the value of her own space. I drove past a garden center on my way home. I didn't stop to buy an apple pie. I didn't stop to buy something for Grace. I stopped and bought a small pot of lavender for myself. I put it on my kitchen counter, right where the apple pie used to sit. It smelled like heaven. It smelled like boundaries. It smelled like a new beginning. The day of the closing was a Thursday in June. It was a typical North Carolina summer morning. The air was thick and heavy with humidity, and the cicadas were already starting their rhythmic buzzing in the oak trees. I woke up at 5 in the morning, long before the sun had cleared the horizon. I walked through my empty house one last time. It is a strange feeling to walk through a house where you have spent 20 years when all the furniture is gone. The rooms looked larger, but they felt smaller. I could see the rectangular shadows on the walls where the paintings used to hang. I could see the indentations in the carpet where our bed had rested for 2 decades. Every empty space was a memory. I stopped at the pantry door. I looked at the faint pencil marks where we had tracked David's growth. I had thought about painting over them, but I decided to leave them. Perhaps the new family would see them and feel the love that had lived here. I hoped their little girl would grow up to be happy in these halls. I went out to the backyard. This was the hardest part. James's roses. They were in their second bloom of the season. The petals were covered in morning dew, looking like tiny jewels. I had spent so many hours tending to them after James passed away. They were my way of staying connected to him. I knelt down in the dirt, despite the fact that I was wearing my best navy blue suit for the legal meeting. I touched the soft petals of a deep red rose. "I have to go now, James," I whispered. "I cannot stay here just to water the past. I need to find a garden where I can grow too." I didn't take a cutting. I didn't take a shovel. I decided to leave the roses exactly where they were. They belonged to this house. They were part of the history of this land. I took a deep breath, stood up, and brushed the dirt from my knees. I felt a strange sense of lightness. It was the feeling of a weight being lifted, a heavy stone that I had been carrying for 3 years. The closing took place at the office of my attorney, Diane. It was a quiet building near downtown Raleigh. Linda was there, looking as sharp as ever. The young couple was there too. They looked nervous and excited. They held hands under the table. I remembered being that young. I remembered the thrill of owning your first piece of the American dream. The paperwork was thick. I signed my name dozens of times. Martha Miller. Martha Miller. Martha Miller. With every signature, I was handing over a piece of my history. When the final paper was signed, Diane handed me a check. $650,000. It was a piece of paper that represented 30 years of hard work, thrift, and love. It was my freedom. It was my security. I tucked it into my purse and shook the young couple's hands. "Take care of the roses," I told them. The young woman smiled at me. Her eyes were bright. "We will, Martha. We promise." I walked out of that office and sat in my car in the parking lot. I didn't drive away immediately. I sat there for 20 minutes and cried. I wasn't crying because I was sad. I was crying because I was finally loose. Something that had been held tight for a very long time had finally come undone. I was no longer the keeper of the shrine. I was just a woman with a car and a future. The drive to Cary was only 25 minutes, but it felt like a journey to a different world. Cary is a beautiful town. It is green and quiet and perfectly kept. My new home was in a community for people 55 and older. It was not a retirement home. It was a place for active adults who were ready for a new chapter. My new apartment was on the second floor. It had a small balcony that looked out over a grove of pine trees. The light in the morning was incredible. It flooded through the glass doors and made the hardwood floors glow. The movers arrived an hour after I did. They brought in the few things I had chosen to keep. James's favorite reading chair, the mahogany desk, the framed photo of us at David's graduation, my books, my clothes. By sunset, the boxes were mostly unpacked. Ruth came over around 7. She brought a bottle of wine and a large pepperoni pizza. We didn't have a table yet, so we sat on the floor of the living room. Ruth raised her glass. "To whatever comes next, Martha." "To whatever comes next," I echoed. We sat there in the fading light, eating pizza and talking. We didn't talk about the house in Raleigh. We talked about the herb garden I was going to start on the balcony. We talked about the walking trails in the community. We talked about the pottery class I wanted to take. As I looked around my new space, I realized something important. I had spent 3 years trying to fit myself into the small corners of David's life. I had been like a plant trying to grow in a dark closet. Now, I was in the sun. The apartment was quiet, but it was a good quiet. It was the silence of a clean slate. I went to bed that night and slept in a room that didn't have any ghosts. I didn't wait for the phone to ring. I didn't check my messages to see if David had noticed I wasn't around. I was in Cary. I was 72 years old. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I wanted to be. I was not a mother waiting for an invitation. I was a woman who had invited herself to a new life. The road to Cary was short, but it had taken me 3 years of pain to find it. As I closed my eyes and listened to the wind in the pine trees outside my window, I knew I had finally made it home. I had been in my new apartment for 6 days before the silence was broken. During those 6 days, I had established a new routine. I woke up at 6. I made a pot of French press coffee. I sat on my balcony and watched the squirrels in the pine trees. I spent my mornings at the local library or walking the greenway trails. I had already met a woman named Joyce who lived down the hall. She was a retired teacher from New York, and she had a laugh that could be heard from the parking lot. I felt visible. I felt like a person again, not just a biological fact in someone else's life. Then, on Friday afternoon, my phone rang. It was David. I took a deep breath before I answered. I wanted to be calm. I wanted to be steady. I didn't want to sound like a woman who had been waiting for this call. Because I hadn't been. "Hello, David," I said. "Mom?" His voice was high and strained. He sounded out of breath. "Mom, I just drove by the house. What is going on?" "Which house is that, David?" I asked. I knew I was being a bit difficult, but I wanted him to say the words. "Our house. The family home. I drove by to drop off some mail that came to our place for you, and there is a moving truck in the driveway. There are people I have never seen before carrying boxes inside. There is a sold sign on the lawn." "Yes," I said. My voice was as calm as if I were discussing the weather. "I sold the house." "David, the closing was last Thursday." There was a long, stunned silence. I could hear the sound of traffic in the background on his end. I imagined him standing on the sidewalk of the street where he grew up, looking at a door he no longer had a key to. You sold it? He finally whispered. Without telling me? Without saying a word? Mom, how could you do that? That was our house. That was James's house. No, David, I said gently. That was my house. Your father and I worked 30 years to pay for it. And when he died, it became my responsibility. I decided it was time to let it go. But why? Why wouldn't you talk to me about it? We could have helped you. We could have. I don't know. We could have discussed it. I felt a spark of the old nurse in me. The one who had to tell patients the hard truth even when they didn't want to hear it. David, I have been trying to talk to you for 3 years, I said. I've been trying to tell you things, important things, about how I was feeling. I tried at lunch on Glenwood Avenue. I tried every Sunday when I drove 40 minutes to see you. But you weren't listening. What are you talking about? We talk all the time. We exchange texts. I send you pictures of Grace. We exchange information, David. We do not talk. Talking requires listening, and listening requires valuing the person who is speaking. For 3 years, I have felt like a ghost in your life. I heard what Emily said last week. I heard her say, I was suffocating you. And I heard you agree with her. The silence on the other end of the line was different this time. It wasn't just shock. It was the heavy silence of a man who had been caught. Mom, you were there? You heard that? I was in the hallway, David. I had an apple pie in my hands. I drove all that way because I missed you. And I stood there and listened to my own son agree that I was a burden. I didn't say it with anger. I didn't say it with tears. I said it as a matter of fact. I am not angry, I continued. I want you to understand that. I realize that you have your own life and your own priorities. Emily was right about that. But I also have a life, and I decided that I was not going to spend the rest of it in a waiting room, hoping you would find a Sunday to fit me in. Where are you? He asked. His voice sounded small. I am in Cary. I have a lovely apartment. It is smaller, but it is mine. It has a balcony and a lot of light. I have already started a garden. Cary? That is almost an hour away, depending on traffic. It is a distance that works for me, I said. I don't understand why you had to be so extreme, David said, his voice rising again. Selling the whole house? Moving away? It feels like you are punishing us. If my absence feels like a punishment, David, then perhaps you should ask yourself why you took my presence for granted for so long. I am not punishing you. I am simply removing a weight that you said was suffocating you. I am giving you exactly what you and Emily wanted. Space. He didn't have an answer for that. I want to ask you a question, I said. And I want you to be honest with yourself before you answer it. When was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? Not to tell me about Grace? Not to ask for a favor? Not to return a call I made first? When was the last time you initiated a conversation because you wanted to know if your mother was okay? He didn't speak. I could hear his breathing. I am 72 years old, I said. I am still a person. I still have things to say. I still have a life that is worth more than just being a babysitter or a cook. I sold the house because that house was a tomb for a version of me that was dying. I moved to Cary to find out who I am now. I'm sorry, Mom, he said. He sounded like he was crying. I didn't realize. I didn't mean to make you feel invisible. I know you didn't mean to, David. That is the problem. You did it without thinking. It became your habit, and I allowed it to become mine. But the habit is broken now. We talked for a few more minutes. But the conversation was different. The power dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the one nattering on, trying to keep him on the phone. I was the one who ended the call. I have a pottery class starting in an hour, I said. I need to go. I'll send you my new address in a text. You are welcome to visit. But please, call first. I hung up the phone and sat on my balcony. My heart was beating fast. But I felt incredibly proud of myself. I had said the words. I had stood up for the woman I used to be. and the woman I was becoming. I looked at my lavender plant. It was small, but it was sturdy. It was growing in its own space, under its own light. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was Martha. And for the first time in 60 days, or maybe 6 years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. I still wake up early. That is a habit 31 years of nursing will never let me break. I make my coffee, and I take it out to the balcony. I look at my herbs in their pots, the lavender, the rosemary, the basil that keeps trying to bolt in the Carolina heat. And I think about my mother. I think about her saying that the most dangerous thing a woman can do is build her life around people who are not building their lives around her. She was right. She usually was. This morning, my granddaughter Grace called me. She is 7 years old now. She called me on her father's phone and said, "Grandma, can we come this weekend? I want to smell the plants again." "Yes," I told her. "Come on Saturday. I will make the pie." After I hung up, I stood on the balcony for a long time with my coffee going cold in my hands. I felt something I haven't had a word for until recently. It is not exactly happiness. It is deeper than that. It is the feeling of a life that is genuinely, at last, your own. I am not invisible. I never was. I was just standing in rooms where no one thought to look up. Now, I live in a room that I chose. I live with light that I love. I am tending things that grow. And the people who come to my table now, they come because they truly want to be there. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything. There are things I know now that I wish I had known earlier. I know that loving someone does not mean making yourself available to be diminished by them. I know that showing up is only worth something if the other person is genuinely glad you are there. And I know in my bones that the most radical thing I ever did was stop waiting to be chosen and start choosing myself. I was not going to spend the rest of my days in somebody's waiting room. I am 72 years old, and my story is not over. It is just finally being written by me. Thank you for listening to my journey. It means a lot to know I am not alone in these feelings. Before you go, I would love to hear from you. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice to reclaim your own life? Please, share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one of them. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us share more stories of strength and grace with people who need to hear them. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember, you are worth the light.